Hello everybody. I would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Zacharias Angelakopoulos and I'm the Product and Solution Manager for Printec Group of Companies. Today, together with INETCO, our partner INETCO, we will see how to use big data to improve card usage and customer engagement. Printec is in automated transaction business for 25 plus years, having a holistic approach of e-payments through all payment channels, leading the digital transformation in our region following the security and compliance legislation. Printec is able to understand the financial institution needs and business. Having already a real big data monitoring story, which is BKM in Turkey. BKM is the major processor in Turkey, having as customers 29 banks. We can show you today how this big data monitoring story can be applied to your business as well. So BKM, the major processor in Turkey for 29 banks, had a challenge to follow and to, let's say, monitor the transactions through alternative digital service channels for their customers. So new applications roll out. It was a big issue, a major challenge for them to go through. So the solution is a new generation of customer experience management solution that involves real-time transaction monitoring, helping them to have a full visibility into the performance of each individual customer interaction. And this is something that we are not saying it by ourselves. We have the testimony of BKM, what they said about the solution which actually have been implemented by Printec and INETCO. Having said that, I would like to pass the microphone to Mr. Kambiz in order to provide you more information about the solution. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, Zach. Good morning, everyone. I'm Kambiz Asrar-Hagegi, and I'm the product manager at INETCO for our solutions. Happy to spend the next little while with you. And we'll start off by telling a story about data optimization and talking about how that relates to your business or any business for that matter. And then touch on some of the trends and innovations that are happening in technology as a whole, and then go through some use cases that we have come across, just a sample set that relate to BKM, Zach mentioned, and then we'll open it up to questions. So at any point, feel free to put in a question, and if there's an opportunity through the presentation, I will stop and address them, or we'll leave them for the very end. But use the question entry field right below the presentation, and you can submit any questions you might have. So let's start by meeting Sir Dave Brailsford. Some of you may know who this is, and he is the performance director for the national cycling team in Britain. Now, what he has become famous for is the idea of aggregation of marginal gains, and adding up these marginal gains gives you a significant increase. So in 2010, he was hired to be Great Britain cycling team's head coach, performance director, essentially. And within 2 years, he was able to win the first Tour de France, and followed that up with winning 70% of all the medals in men's cycling at the London Olympic Games. Now, his entire philosophy is around looking at each and every aspect of the process and simply improving it by just 1%. And as a result, all these aggregations of these little gains gives you a big improvement. Of course, we're talking about the world stage. It's the Olympic team. They are already really pushing every aspect to the epitome of the sport, but still, by focusing on all these little increments, whether it be nutrition to bike performance to physical conditioning, to the fact that they would bring their own beds with them throughout the course of events like the Tour de France, so that it was completely consistent. That's how they achieved this unprecedented success. Now, why start with this? Well, for some of you, actually, this question should say, for some of us even, what would 10 or 20% increase actually mean to us? But then these are aspects that play a role in any of our card businesses, and they're things that we can look at. So if you imagine, what if we had, an increase in card usage by 1%? At the same time, we reduced our customer acquisition costs. Our activations were better. Just applying this aggregation of marginal gains theory, all of a sudden, an investment in big data, which can influence all of these things and more, starts to make a lot of sense. It's not about the 1%, but it's about making that data available and being able to bring improvements in all sorts of areas. Now, if we look at this from the perspective of technology, and we look at different aspects that are in the data flow, in the data continuum, we see things like data accessibility, having the info that you need and all the data that you have about your customers or their actions or interactions or transactions and feedback, being able to access that easily. You might be looking at things like, what is the technology that I have or the tools that I have that actually allow me to access this information and pull out the meaningful data out of it. Or it might be around, say, resources and skills. Are we relying on others to provide us the insight that we need, the information that we need? Everybody's swamped. Everybody's overworked. How are we going to be able to use the limited resources to actually achieve what we want? So these are just some of the common problems that people face when making big data work for them. And I'm sure in every scenario it's going to be a little bit different. So actually, on that note, I'd like to get a sense of the listeners we have here on the line. And if you look below the slides there's a poll question area, and you can start to answer the poll here. And the question is, just along the lines of what we looked at, you'll see we've put it down to 5 answers just because of to keep it a little bit more contained. But all the areas we just talked about and improving by 1%, in your situation, what when it comes to using big data or trying to move in that direction and get there, what are the things that you see that are the biggest? What is the biggest challenge in your scenario, in your bank right now? Is it access to the data, actually being able to collect it, having it there? Is it you have the data, but the latency and processing speed? So it might be days or weeks before that data is in a form that you can actually use and feed into some of the other maybe reporting or dashboarding. Is it that the technologies are slow and you spend a lot of time redoing the same tasks, or you don't have the right tools. We talked about resources or skills. Or is it once you have all these pieces and you have the information, is it being able to get it into the right hands of the right user? So we'll let this run a little bit, and curious to see as the answers come in. So far, it looks pretty consistent in terms of data accessibility. That's very common, in fact. Trying to get the data and have a clean source of master data that you can rely on is always a situation that comes up. So if you haven't seen it yet, it's just below the slides. You can see the poll question there, and you can click on one of the options there and start voting. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds and then close it out and see where the poll results actually end up. We've got a bit more variability now. It looks like resources and skills are a big factor. And in fact, having that expertise seems to be a big problem area here. Why don't we give it 10 more seconds and we'll shut this down. Those final votes, put them in. I'm going to close out shortly. All right, well, so we have the leading one is definitely limited resources and skills. Well, everybody is overworked. Everybody's got some limitations in terms of resources, but skills is an interesting one too. You know, we're moving from perhaps older technology. We're trying to adopt new technology. We have a lot more data than we've ever had. The definition of big data with the variety and velocity and volume that's coming in, you know, we need new skill sets to be able to handle that, and we're definitely seeing that here. At the same time, the other two pieces are getting our hands on the data in a timely fashion. Actually, this ties in really well to what I was going to talk about next. And so the good news from what we saw on this poll question just now is that there's so many things that are happening from a technology perspective on data storage, analysis, visualization capabilities that are making it easier to extract valuable information about card usage and customer experience. As this data is increasingly large and diverse, it's becoming more affordable to be able to collect this data, whether it's through data stores like Hadoop or in the cloud. And that has resulted, if we look along the bottom there of our data continuum, we've been able to push this data from just a batch mode store and retrieve. Things have moved on to relational database, big data, and where people are aspiring to, where they're trying to go now is around enterprise data-driven applications, but also fast data. So getting this data available as quickly as possible with real-time streaming and make those decisions so much faster. In conjunction with that, analytics and visualizations have also had a similar trend. We've gone from some historical analysis or maybe just viewing and less analysis to forecasting, trending, some predictive algorithms. maybe some machine learning techniques, and eventually some artificial intelligence, where you spit the data in based on the training set, based on the information. It comes back with suggestions and recommendations, understanding your specific business aspects. And then on the front end of it, tools-wise, this didn't actually come up. May not be such a problem area with the audience we have today, but as far as visualization has gone, we've come a long way from standard reports and really busy Excel sheets with hundreds of numbers on a single page, all the way to interactive dashboards and on-demand dashboards as well. So before we dive into some of the use cases, I just wanted to point out a quick quote from Gartner, as well as do another very quick poll question before we get into the use cases. And this is something that we're seeing more and more. It's a lot of people are providing the same kind of functionality. It's becoming commoditized, and according to Gartner, almost 90% of companies expect to compete mostly on the basis of customer experience. And when you look at customer experience, having data to be able to actually address that and provide the best customer experience is the number one way of trying to address that. Now, more and more divisions in financial institutions are relying on data for their jobs. This includes marketing, IT, channel operations, security, fraud, customer experience teams that actually want to see the behavior of all of the different groups working in conjunction and what the result's going to be in terms of the customer. So data is becoming ever more important across all these aspects. Now, just before we jump into our use cases, let's have a quick poll question one more time. Just as we're looking at our cards programs and within our financial institution, wanted to find out from you what your top business metric is for running card programs. Now, this, again, given the limitation that we can only show 5 things on there, there's card activation, how many people have actually activated the cards they've received, usage frequency, how often people are using our card on a monthly basis, for example, the average revenue per customer, how much are we making off of a single customer, and again, because of the limitation, that might include different factors of revenue in there. Customer churn, are we losing customers? Is that a metric that you monitor and is the key one, the top one in this list that you care about? Or in this instance, we have an other field. So if there is one that you feel very strongly about and you'd want that to be your top answer, please click that and put your answer in the questions area, which is also below the slide. Interesting to see if we have something there as well. Votes are starting to come in. Have a number of them already. Looks like usage frequency right now is actually quite high. Card activation, nobody at all so far. And I'm very impressed that there's no others just yet. If there's any other metric that you feel strongly about, please click that, click the other, and we'll close this poll in about 10 seconds. So put in any last votes you might have. Okay, all right. By a long lead, actually, usage frequency seems to be the #1 metric, at least in our audience today. This is fairly consistent with what we see. In fact, in one of the examples, in one of the use cases that we'll be going through momentarily, we'll see that a lot of people as well that we interact with also perform segmentation using usage frequency, and we'll look at that. But thank you very much for voting. So as we're about to switch to the use cases, I just want to mention, although this is real data, it has been completely cleansed and anonymized so that there's no sensitive information by anybody. And in some cases, as a result, we'll have more cleansed data versus others. So as a first example, as a first use case, we might be looking at this from the perspective of what is the current status of my card programs. We want to have the ability to see a bird's eye view of our different card programs. We see an overview in this case here of both our debit versus our credit cards and how they're doing. We can see along here, actually, if you look on the left-hand side, we're able to see information about the networks. Down the middle, we see information about our customer activity and engagement. And then on the right-hand side, we see volume and value data. So if we look at this more closely, you see there's actually 3 bars here. And in this instance, they're showing what networks our card traffic is coming in off of. So the light blue line here being MasterCard. We have 3 networks, in fact. There is an other network that is quite small. You see it in this instance. And then the Pulse network. So these are 3 diverse networks, 3 ways into our card systems for authorization. And we get to see where the volume's coming from, and what the value of each of these are. There's definitely a strong correlation between the two. As you see both volume on the top left and value at the bottom. When we look at customer engagement, what we're able to see is that bird's eye view or executive view of how it is actually performing this week compared to last. Now, as I was explaining, since this is a demo, we're looking at a Saturday on April 16th, 2016. Which is why the blue line here is this week's data, and it ends on Friday, and it hasn't populated Saturday just yet. But we can see that in terms of this week versus last week, we started off weaker, but we're tracking the last 2 days of the week compared to last week. And then you have a parallel view of the debit card performance versus the credit card performance. And looking at it from different granularity of the number of card users that we have, the volume of transactions, the number of approved transactions, and also the value of these transactions. As we can see, over the last 90-day average, there's been a positive change for debit all around. Credit card, we've got an improvement in number of card users, and the volume's gone up slightly as a result. But there's fewer transactions. The number of approved transactions has gone down, and the value has actually dropped by 10%. So immediately from my executive view, I can see a problem area present itself and something to go look into further, or ask my card channel manager to go look into further. And then on the right-hand side, we have a debit versus credit volume versus value. And that is a moving weekly average. We'll switch and look at a different use case here. And this is around, we touched on this a little bit earlier, it's around segmentation of our customers. Trying to understand their spending habits. So we get an overview of the entire card program, and we can compare how each card is doing and look at the card responses and look at that by segment. So in this example, we see that the number of card users, we have over 450,000 card users. Those are the active users on my network. Those are the actual users on my network. In the date selection that I've included here, we have 1.5 million transactions, and that's 786 million in terms of the dollar value of these transactions. And then what I can look at more specifically is, what do my active users look like? Out of this 462, it's actually really good news that 434 of them have been active in the trailing 30 days. So in this context, this customer cared about a 30-day activity usage frequency that we just talked about. And the segmentation aspect and their lens on it was, how many of my users fall into a power user bucket versus common users versus low users. Having that visibility and understanding can be the first step in trying to move people up this chain and make them more power users. Now, this unfortunately is a screenshot, and I don't have this interactive, but essentially through selecting any of these segments, I'm able to see how many transactions their default is, what the average dollar value and histogram of their dollar spending looks like, but also the different merchant categories that they spend their money on. So in this case, grocery stores and supermarkets is by far the biggest category that people spend money on. Now, whether you have already ways that you segment customers and you look at them, whether it's usage frequency in this case, or whether you're using a clustering algorithm based on volume of transactions and dollar spend and category spend, for example, a k-means type algorithm to come up with the different clusters so you can understand those segments better and then decide how you're going to address them. All that, your big data strategy should allow you to access and address all those kinds of things. Let's move on to a different use case here, and this use case is around campaigns and trying to see which campaigns accelerate our revenues more than others. Now, this could be based on different card types or reward types that we might have, or it could be the same card or the same card that we're looking at, or based on different periods, based on different offers that we might have in different periods. So in this scenario we're showing, it's actually the same card type, and it's looking at two alternate periods. We're looking at a reference period, we're looking at a promotional period, and the promotion went for 2 weeks, so we're doing a comparison between these 2 weeks. Now, here, we wanted to go in layers and see more and more detail what's actually happening. We're looking at it from a transaction volume perspective, transaction value, as well as seeing the distinct card users and the number of approved transactions. So more granularity in terms of what our customers are doing, the engagement level, how many transactions it's driving. Now, unfortunately, in this example, this campaign doesn't seem to be effective at all. You have 2 time periods, 2-week comparisons, and if I were to draw an imaginary trend line between these two, which you should be able to as well add on if you wanted to, they look visually very, very consistent. But we have this data immediately. Even if my second period had been only a week through, we would see the green reference line, we'd see half of the blue line, and we'd see how we're trending, so we can make adjustments and do tests along the way. So getting closer and closer to real-time, quote-unquote, fast data makes you capable of making those decisions a lot quicker and actually adjusting and using the data to make better decisions. Let's move on to another example here. And in this scenario, we're looking at transactions and trying to identify if there are strange behaviors or transactional patterns that we don't expect. So spotting card use anomalies that may indicate fraud. In this use case and in this interactive dashboard, what you're looking for, in essence, and this could be alarmed on the same scenario, but in this case, we've had make the assumption we've gotten the alarm, we've gone back to try and do some analysis on it, and we're pulling out a time frame of a 2-week period, and we're trying to identify where individual cardholders may have used their card more frequently than is normal. So in this case, we're saying look at daily periods and trigger every time an individual user has more than 7, in this case, ATM transactions. Now, you might say this should be 20 and we want to look at all their card transactions. And that's a valid minor change to make to this. But then what this use case in this dashboard is showing me is all of a sudden I have a number of individual customers that pop up. And what I see on the left-hand side, this ID is actually an anonymized unique ID per single customer. So that allows us to see situations like this where this unique ID has almost 8 or 9 different days where they have more than 7 transactions, which definitely begs the question of what is going on. So if I look at this, for example, third customer, and I pick one of the single days where they did have this high level of activity, I'm able to see on the right-hand side not only all the locations that they frequented when they were, all the ATMs that they went to while they did their transactions, and I can draw a circle around this and see that this was actually a 13-mile radius, so it's not exactly going from one location beside to another location. It's actually quite an effort to go this far. But also I can see the individual transactions and the periods below, and they start at 12:30 a.m. at quite regular intervals, and it seems like the space in between them is probably travel time, and they end at 4:53 a.m. So in a span of 5 hours, there's a total of almost 40 transactions here. And if we look at transaction value, every single one is $120 of either being withdrawn or deposited. So very quickly, I've been able to identify, based on the trigger that I had, based on the alert that I had, an individual customer and behavior that they've had more consistently. let's look at one more use case before we tie this up. And so you may be asking where this data comes from and what else can we use this for. So at a base level, before you do any of the analytics and before you look at the different use cases from a business perspective, the underlying question is my card channel working? Now, if you are able to monitor the transactions and the channel and the network and the different endpoints in real time, you have an operational view that lets you monitor your card networks. In this case, we'd be looking at the overall rate of transactions going through our card network. We have, in this scenario, some ATM side of things. We have Visa and Pulse as our networks coming into our Postilion network. And we see that for the most part, we had a spike in data rates, but pretty consistent. Some bad rate incidents that if they cross our threshold would alert us on and then would be worth looking into. But at the same time, as the bad rates occur, we also see that our average duration for our responses, our response time, has started to go up in the last 30 seconds or so. This 60-second view diagram here shows us that for the most part, we were around the 5-second mark for the first 30 seconds, but in the last 30 seconds, we've had some spikes and things taking as long as 40 seconds in this case. Also, when you have this data in real time, you're able to see things to recognize if they're out of the ordinary, whether our transactions are coming in through magstripe or chip or tap or manual entry. So it gives you the ability from an operational standpoint to make sure your card channel is working, but also make that data accessible and provide it to other resources, other tools for the business unit themselves to be able to analyze and use in their own use cases. So those were just some example use cases, give you a flavor of some of the cards aspects and what we might be seeing. So really, we're all, from that perspective, all of us are at different points in our journey in the big data journey, and it's really just the roadmap, and it's a work in progress. So in our ideal scenario, we might want to have real-time customer analytics across all our channels, starting with ATM or mobile or social channels or POS. But I would suggest really start off small and have a plan in place and take bite-sized chunks of pieces to progress and not try and do everything at the same time or boil the ocean, as they say. So, for example, if collection of the data is a hard situation for you, or if you're not happy with the integrity of the data and you need to worry about the cleansing of it and making sure that the data is reliable, it's what you expect to see, all the fields are available, you don't lose any fields that you don't understand the information about, or perhaps it's combining it with different data sources and integrating different things together. You may be seeing that actually doing some calculations on the back end or some clustering or segmentation in the back end is where you need to focus your attention on, so that you can have more meaningful visualizations and allow the end user to be able to analyze it more effectively. So we would recommend pick one, pick two maybe, focus on those areas, improve and move those along, and then tackle on new ones. It's the technology that we looked at. If you think back to the technology progression slide. Everything is moving so quickly, and it's all happening in parallel that there's no right answer. And you've got to be nimble, and you've got to be able to try different things so that you can get the information, get to where you need to be, and make a decision in terms of where can I get good, reliable data that's going to feed in all my systems, or what's some verticalized calculations and visualizations that are going to make my life easier, which feeds into my overall strategy. So having said that, let's have our last poll question here, and we're going to look at these same segments. Again, because we were restricted to 5 answers in the webinar, I've combined a couple of these things. So again, we had the collection. We have, so now that we've gone through this, you've seen some of the use cases. What area presents the biggest challenge for you today from your perspective? So is it the collection of the data and this type of information that we looked at and the use cases that we touched on? Was it making sure the data is clean and being able to combine it with different sources? So we saw the ability to recognize bins so that you know what bank someone's with or what location it belongs to. We had some demographic information on the maps. You have the ability to include customer segmentation data, things of that nature. Or is it free to calculate and analyze? So you have information coming in, be able to define those cluster algorithms, or be able to have a forecast of where you think, where the system thinks your transaction volume is going to go, and alert you in advance of that happening in case you need to avert something. Or is it a visualization challenge? Do you not have a good way to actually communicate the information that you have, whether it be tools or charts or reports or interactive dashboards? Or alerting, for that matter, being able to trigger the right information to the right person for visualization. And again, there's the other box. So if there's something you feel strongly about and you want to let us know, click other and then put that answer in the questions box, and we'll look at it also. So the votes are coming in, which is great to see. And it's like cleansing and combining with other data sources is just a little bit ahead right now, with calculate and analyze right on its tail. So we'll give this another 10 or 15 more seconds to close out. But again, is it collection of the data? Is it cleansing and combining it with different data sources to make it even richer and more meaningful? Being able to run algorithms on it and calculations and analysis, or being able to visualize it? Okay, so let's close this in 5. Any last votes coming in? Okay, I think we're good. Cleansing and combining seems to be the biggest pain point with the audience today. We see this actually quite frequently, and in fact, you do get the scenarios where there's so many different bits of the business that have access to different pieces of data as well, where it's all being collected, but it's the combination of these bits of data. It's the being able to correlate the bits of data so that you can actually get a more holistic view that does present a big challenge a lot of the times. So if you have one source of truth and you're able to correlate this data across different sources, it makes it a lot easier. Well, thank you very much for that. And with that, we will wrap up this webinar and gives us a little bit of time to answer some questions. And it looks like we've had a couple of questions come in through the course of the webinar as people have been listening to this, which is great to see. So the first question I have here is how recent must the transaction data be? That's a really good question. I mean, back to what we were talking about earlier, it's really about what is the use case and what are you trying to achieve and what are you trying to solve. Always start with that problem at hand, and then that'll usually make it pretty obvious where you need to go in terms of the data and what kind of data you need. There are situations where we looked at the network latency, and that has suddenly jumped to 40 seconds. That could be an early warning for your system about to fall off a cliff and slow down and crash. And so you want that to be a real-time data feed that you're able to react on immediately. You could have a scenario where you're looking at post-campaign analysis. And in that scenario, where we looked at the 2 campaigns in 2-week time period, well, 2 weeks might not be a problem. This is something you want to look at post-analysis. However, even in that instance, I would suggest that being able to look at it on a daily basis or even every few days gives you a chance to adjust the campaign as it's happening. So really it starts with what is your problem at hand and what are you trying to resolve. Okay, we'll go on to another question here is, does this capture card transactions happening online and via mobile as well? What about prepaid cards coming from a third-party service? Good question. Yeah, I mean, as we all know, the computers we carry in our pockets are just as powerful, and we can pay for almost anything with them as well. What actually ends up happening in the back end is all those mobile transactions get tokenized and it comes in. We have the information available as well to be able to identify whether this is a mobile pay type transaction, where it's coming from, and lots of information about the PAN entry, what the network is, and all that information, surprisingly, is actually in the raw transaction data, and you can actually see it and pull it out and decode it and normalize it and actually make decisions on it and try and use it to your advantage. We had one client we were working with and talking to, and they had actually a very successful mobile app that they were using and leveraging. But given market demand and what people were asking, they also incorporated their credit cards into Apple Pay. Now, and put in a big campaign around the introduction of Apple Pay, the launch of that product version. Now, what they failed to look at was the impact it was going to have on their own mobile wallet transactions, which were twice as lucrative, generated twice the revenue as the Apple Pay transaction. Now, the campaign was wildly successful. It rolled out very, very well, but the unintended effect it had was reducing their own revenues by a lot. And when we started the conversations with them, they didn't have the ability to see this information in real time. And it wasn't until the first month had passed when they looked at the data and the success of the campaign, realizing that they've shifted their own revenue into Apple revenue by making it so successful. So yes, we can see that information. We can see it from wherever it might come, but also bring that in at a timely manner is important. We'll try and address a couple more questions before the end of the session. So try and make sure we end on time. But here's one more that's come in. Says, what other data should be integrated with transactions? Well, we touched on this, I think, a little bit through the use cases when we were talking earlier. But it really comes down to what you're trying to capture. In a card scenario, obviously bins are very important to see which, if we have a pause scenario or if we have an ATM scenario, you can see not only your on-us transactions, you can see your off-us transactions, you can see your remote on-us transactions. Not only that, but also see which bank people are affiliated with, what cards they might be using, what type of cards, which is information available within the bin data. Right? Whether it's a standard card or a platinum card or it's some sort of rewards or cashback type information. So that brings a lot of value. And then tying in your own customer information or CRM data actually enriches the data a whole lot. As we saw in some of the use cases, we have anonymized, unique customers that we see here. But by tying that back to your actual user customer data and the CRM, then you're actually able to see exactly the information based on individual customers or clusters of customers and segments of customers and be able to target them in the segment of one. Hopefully that answers your question. Essentially, actually, just one more tie into that. Any kind of information that you have that you deem valuable could be added in. We have a scenario as well where one of our customers has an overlay of all of their customer densities across the different cities that they operate in, so that they can see the card usage versus the density of their customers, and also the segment of the customers. Are they power users? Are they regular users? Or are they low users? And how they fit into the different cities. So really being able to, as we saw, cleansing and combining was a big deal. Being able to do that just makes the data more valuable. So this question here must be from someone, perhaps at a bank or a processor. The question says, how would we share this data with our merchants? So I assume by that you mean that some of the information here is valuable, especially maybe on the market category side of things. And you want to be able to show that to your merchants who have your POS devices or your POS systems, or they use your bank to acquire transactions perhaps. So a lot of the use cases we saw here are based on cloud-based or hosted type visualization and interactive dashboards. So this obviously can be deployed in a SaaS model, or it can be based on scheduled reports that can be sent, or the same kind of access and things that we looked at ourselves could be put into a similar portal which you could use to generate custom things for those merchants, or they could be used directly by the merchants themselves. There's, I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap it up from there. there's a few more in here, but if you want your questions, we can see who the question came from, so we can always reach out to you and give you the response offline in that case. But we'll take one more question here, and the question is, we looked at a scenario that showed the velocity of card usage. Is there some other example that we could recognize in real time that there could be a fraud situation? So actually, there is you may have heard about this actually in the news recently. There have been a number of stories where cards have been used, fraudulent cards have been used to be able to pull money out of various ATMs and steal a lot of money through organized crime. Now, in a couple of situations where we've actually engaged with some customers that we have, even though they had fraud systems in place, fraud systems are really, really well designed to be able to recognize anomalies, understand threats as they come in, and identify the threats, and by being in line to actually intervene and stop the transactions from happening. But a lot of the issues that we're reading about today, these days on the web, and the news stories that we see are actually as a result of advanced persistent threats. And an advanced persistent threat is actually a lot more complicated than a single transaction that does not conform or is an anomaly. It usually consists of many components, many people involved, and it's a threat that may be in the system but sitting dormant for a while before it's activated. Now, in a case that we address that actually falls outside of some of the fraud systems, and where we're complementary with those fraud systems, is looking at a switch correlation mechanism. Now, Postilion switches or other switches, in fact, older switches even, might be more vulnerable to these kind of threats. We had a scenario where there was malware that was placed on a Postilion switch, and this malware, when triggered, which was many weeks later, when triggered, would actually approve transactions in a stand-in mode and not go back for authorization. Now, from the perspective of any fraud system, or from the perspective of the ATM where the money was being withdrawn from, or from the perspective of the payment switch itself, the processing switch itself, everything seemed legitimate, but what was actually happening was it was standing in and actually approving these when it shouldn't be. Now, because our solution is able to look at all these different data links across the network and be able to correlate them, we were able to see that although these requests were coming in from the ATMs, no request was ever going to the authorization host, even though the network was active, even though the communication link was working. And then there was an authorization happening without any communication with the authorization host. Now, this was, as you can see, social engineering to get this malware put into the system. Somebody has put a USB onto the switch, and the switch is actually running this. And then it's been triggered after some latent dormant time for it to actually operate this way. But then when you can see the entire transaction network, and you can see the two sides of the switch and see that the transactions are not passing through, we're able to trigger an alert identifying this as a malicious behavior, abnormal behavior, and actually alert the security and the fraud teams to actually shut this down. Now, as things are getting more and more sophisticated and hackers are getting sophisticated, you may have heard of the poison tap, stealing your credentials off the laptop in under 13 seconds. There's so many instances of things that are coming up with people getting more intelligent. Having a layered approach to security as well becomes very important. So I hope that gives another example of fraud, and in this case, advanced persistent threats, and how you could leverage the system to actually combat that as well. With that, we've actually gone over the hour mark. Thank you so much for attending this webinar and staying with us, and all the great questions that have come in. There are some attachments and links that are associated with this webinar that you're able to download, and it's the Analytics and Insight, INETCO Analytics and INETCO Insight product sheets. And feel free to reach out to me or to your Printec account manager if you have any questions to follow up on. Thank you very much, and have a great day.